This is my first time meeting him. He is a professor at Creighton. And what I do when I put a call out for presenters, and I put it out to people who have presented in the past. And we've had presenters from Creighton University. And an individual led me to Dr. Sparkman. And so it's a pleasure to have you here. Please help me in welcoming him.
All right, thank you.
So you can advance by here or by here.
Right here, perfect. I'm a clicker guy. I try to move about the room, make it a little exciting. All right, afternoon, everybody. I know y'all have been in the room a while, so I will try to make it as exciting as possible. For the Nebraska fans in the room, it's 10:10. They just started the second half. Just want to give you the update. I know that's important. As y'all can tell, I'm from the South. I understand the importance of football. So I wanted to lead with that. So, well, thank you very much for having me here today. You know, it's an honor. It's a privilege because, I worked as a pharmacy technician for multiple years, and I educated pharmacy technicians that were going for certification. And so through that was really what inspired my research. And so what we're going to go through today is we're going to look at comfort, motivation, and role expansion. Because we know role expansion is the exciting hot button. What can techs do now? What can techs do now? And it's been talked about to death, right? We've all heard about it. So I wanted to get a little more into some things that can affect that and how we as technicians need to be able to communicate and how that's going to be important for successful role expansion. Okay? So we're going to review advanced tech roles. We're going to look at the importance of pharmacists' beliefs in role expansion. We're going to look at the factors that affect those comfort levels among pharmacists. Then we're going to get into motivation and pharmacy technician motivation, the perceptions of pharmacists, and how that motivation impacts messaging on role expansion. So at the end of this, you'll be able to understand why pharmacists' comfort levels with advanced roles for pharmacy technicians are important, and examine and recognize occupational values and how those values are involved in motivation within the workplace, and understand how motivation and communication are important in the likelihood of successful role expansion. So, get started here with pharmacist comfort with advanced technician tasks. So we know the statistics of the growing job market for technicians that come through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We know that we are regulated at state level, so there's variations on what you can do depending on where you practice. We know that, for technicians with advanced training, if I went about 10 miles that way, I could do a lot more than I can here in Omaha. So we understand these variations, and the calls have been made to create a more standard level of training, as we just talked about, and a more uniform scope of practice by professional organizations, but that variation still remains. So the past 25 years have seen that tremendous growth in the various roles. The institutional setting was the first to really find ways to improve how the pharmacy can be more efficient if they use technicians better. And community pharmacy has been slower, but they have slowly followed suit to find ways to use technicians to create opportunities. But the key is always this caveat at the pharmacist's discretion. When we get into the rules and regulations that exist surrounding advanced technician roles, one of the most common things that we found were these 4 words. State boards of pharmacy are usually explicit with what tasks technicians can and cannot perform within their normal scope of practice, but a lot of those regulations have that caveat at the pharmacist's discretion. So it's all well and good if, a state says, well, techs can do more. But if your pharmacist isn't buying in, it's not really going to truly advance the profession. And so that's why we wanted to look at what were the factors that affected comfort level, and what were those factors that really made pharmacists be a little bit more receptive to technicians taking on different roles. So we did this study actually, literally the survey was sent the Friday before the world went into lockdown during the pandemic. So some of these numbers are a little out of date now, but at the time, it's where we were. So giving and receiving verbal prescriptions, performing non-clinical MTM tasks, verifying prescriptions, and administering immunizations. So we wanted to look at the predictors of pharmacist comfort level with those 4 tasks because they were the 4 that we saw a lot in research and we really wanted to delve in. And then compare pharmacist comfort levels with technicians performing the task. So, among the pharmacists, you see that we got a good mix here. We got, a little over 200 respondents, different levels of education, how long they've been practicing. We really wanted to be as thorough as we could be in the community setting in particular, as far as looking at this. And so among those tasks, what we saw was comfort level, the average comfort level on a scale of 1 to 7, usually went along with how many states permitted technicians to perform the task. So we see that non-clinical MTM tasks, where every state had at least permitted it, had not outright outlawed it, had the highest, compared to verifying prescriptions that 2 states had the lowest. But the other thing that went into that comfort level was seeing what pharmacists thought technicians' ability, interest, and willingness to perform those tasks would be. And in all those cases, they were at least about equal, if not higher, save for perhaps interest, in the ability and willingness as opposed to the comfort level. So we're like, well, that is interesting. So let's delve into that, see what the effect here is. So big old table here of everything we measured. I'm not going to go over everything here, but everything that's highlighted was if a pharmacist had a higher perception of what a technician could do. If they scored higher on what's highlighted, they're more likely to be comfortable with with a technician taking on that task. So the big one that stood out, obviously, because for all 4 tasks it shows up, is technician ability. Could the technician simply do what was being asked of them? So if you're able to show that, that automatically, through what our results showed, meant that your pharmacist was going to be more comfortable with you doing the task. That kind of makes sense. But the second one, the only other one that ended up on more than 2, or on more than 1, was the technician interest. So we see here, outside administering immunizations, ironically, pharmacists who believe that technicians had a higher level of interest in performing a task were going to be more comfortable. So that shows at least a little necessity of communication. If you're able to communicate with your pharmacist, if you're able to communicate with those that you work with and say, yes, I want to take this on, they're going to be more comfortable with that. And if it comes down to that pharmacist discretion that I mentioned at the top, right there, you are already preparing yourself to be more successful. There are a couple other interesting ones I just want to hit on here. For performing non-clinical MTM tasks, we also found that pharmacists who were in more rural settings were more likely to be comfortable with technicians taking on that role. Don't know if that has to do, it'd be something we want to look at, but don't know if that has to do with, well, it's a rural setting, so they know the people better and they're able to communicate better than maybe an urban or suburban. I don't know. It's an interesting look. Administering immunizations. Pharmacists in suburban settings were actually more comfortable with technicians taking that role on, which I also thought was very interesting. I'm assuming, and I don't know, it depends on the states, obviously, But in different states, you have different levels. For me, I worked in Tennessee, where pharmacists were actually permitted to give some of the childhood vaccines for schooling every year. And so whether or not technicians would be permitted to do that, I know that my pharmacist would have probably appreciated that come every late July and August, whenever everybody was lined up out the door to get little Johnny's shots to get in the school. The other interesting one was education. Pharmacists who had PharmDs, which we understand with PharmDs is probably going to be pharmacists who are a little younger, considering the PharmD became the national standard about 2005, if I remember correctly, are more comfortable with technicians administering immunizations. And pharmacists who had completed a residency were more likely to be comfortable with technicians verifying prescriptions. Now, one of the things we think goes on with this is because most residency programs are in an institutional setting, and tech is more common in the hospital setting, so we think that's probably what explains that difference there. But you see from this table, there's a lot that can go into why a pharmacist may be comfortable and why a pharmacist may be more willing to allow that discretion or have the discretion to allow a technician to take on additional roles. So, now as pharmacists' scope of practice expands, because we know at the same time that we're trying to say, let's raise what technicians can do, what's happening with pharmacists is being the same thing. We're seeing that pharmacists are getting a lot more opportunities. And so as that expands, it's going to be likely technicians' scope of practice has to grow with it. So this study gives us insight into the factors that can affect that success of implementation of expanded scope for technicians. The overriding theme, like I just mentioned on the last page, was that if the technician has the ability and the interest to complete these advanced tasks under the guidance and supervision of a pharmacist, the technician can take on that additional responsibility. So, with such importance being placed on ability and interest, there has to be communication. There has to be communication with what the technician has the capability of doing. Even if we may not be interested sometimes, you still have to communicate anytime you might be, because it's going to change those comfort levels. It's going to change that discretion. And if more states determine that expanding technician responsibilities is important within community pharmacy in particular in this study, there's evidence it's important to understand pharmacists in that state before enacting that legislation. Because if discretion is involved, we have to know what pharmacists think, and we have to be ready, because we want this to be successful. If you work as a technician, you want this to be successful. You want to help the pharmacy any way you can, right? That's why you're here. So that was kind of the first study that we did looking at that. So before I move on, any questions about anything I've covered so far? Yes?
Not really a question, but more of an observation. I'm curious to see with that study if some of the comfort levels would have been adjusted if one of the questions for the pharmacist was if you were a pharmacy technician before becoming an intern, before becoming a pharmacist.
That would be something worth looking at. That's very good. Thank you. May have just sparked a little thing in there. All right. Well, if nothing else, we'll go ahead and move on to the second part, looking at motivation and role expansion. So motivation just provides a person with a cause or a reason to act on something. It's the arousal, direction, and persistence of a behavior. And so overall, we can divide these into two separate things. Extrinsic motivators, which are factors that are external to self, and intrinsic motivators, which are your more internal factors. So, motivation arises from within a person, and motivational factors are different for every employee. Some are motivated by money, some because they like to help people, some because they're experts in a particular discipline. But motivation focuses on those factors within the person that energizes them, directs them, sustains them, or stops the behavior. So, before we move on, has anybody seen this already? Have y'all calculated this? Okay. So, for 1, 2, 3, 8, and 9, you add up on a scale 1 to 5 and divide it by 5. And those are actually going to be if you're more extrinsically motivated. Well, that's kind of going to give you a scale there. And then for 4 through 7, if you add those up and divide by 4, those are actually going to be for your intrinsic motivation values. So, when we look here in the room, for folks that have done that, was one number higher than the other? So what did we have higher? Intrinsic or extrinsic? External? Internal. Okay, was anybody about the same? Some people are close to the same. So interestingly enough, these same 9 things were actually measured in pharmacists in the 70s. And they were a little high. There was a couple that were high on external. There's a couple that were high on internal. And there's actually more that were high on both. And so it's really interesting because I think our profession is so different. Because when we look at pharmacy, we have the healthcare. We have our healthcare element that we talk about, but it's a business in a lot of cases, particularly if you're working in community pharmacy. And so in original studies that looked at this motivation, they actually saw that people that were higher on extrinsic in general, and this was done among college students, people who were higher on extrinsic were more likely to go into business. People high in intrinsic were more likely to go into more altruistic service industries like teaching or healthcare. And so I think it's interesting that we do find this mix, and we find across the spectrum these different things within pharmacy that really show how our field is so much different. So thank you all for doing that. But why is knowing this important? Well, we get into motivation and role expansion. So motivation and role expansion, as we try to find new ways for technicians to help within the pharmacy, they are connected because of the importance of messaging provided by managers. So there's 2 reasons that these motivators are important for managers in shaping their messaging. The first is that those who are crafting messages, in this case pharmacists, understand the importance of tailoring messages to maximize their effectiveness to those receiving the messages, pharmacy technicians. I've studied pharmacists and have seen almost every one of them looked at me and said, well, if I wanted to get my technician to do something, it depends on who the technician is. I'm going to tailor it to what they value. So they understand that importance, and we've seen it in, other areas of research over and over again. But the second is a theory of work motivation that comes from Pharm. It actually comes from the 60s. And this theory argued that individuals are most likely to devote their attention, their time, and energy to an opportunity when they believe that the opportunity allows them to express or fulfill their values. Values there could be motivators. It means the same thing in this case. So we've known since the 60s that people are more likely to really say, oh, this is what drives me. This is what moves me from inside. So I'm going to do the thing that lets me fulfill that. So pharmacy technician motivation and perceptions of pharmacists. So it's important for pharmacists to understand technician motivations so that they can properly shape their messaging regarding role expansion. Now, studies have shown that pharmacists believe tailoring messaging is important in this communication, like I just mentioned. I interviewed 20 pharmacists, 19 of them told me I would tailor my message. And the one that didn't just didn't think about it because he used to work with me. So I said, your scores, where some of you said that you were higher extrinsic, some said you were higher intrinsic, some said you were high on both. Among those 20 pharmacists, what I actually found was pharmacists believe that technicians are more extrinsically motivated than intrinsically, to a significant degree. Like on a 5-point scale, the average was almost a 1 whole point difference. So a huge difference in what pharmacists believe. So that gets into tailoring messaging. If we're looking at these motivators and we're looking at what pharmacists think is important, that's how they're going to tailor their messages. Well, if we say, well, you're more likely to devote time that's important to you, but your pharmacist thinks, like those pharmacists, that extrinsic matters more, are the technicians in here who are high on intrinsic values going to respond in the same way? Probably not. So, research has looked at how we tailor messaging and how messaging needs to be crafted. And so, in this case, it would say, well, if a technician's extrinsically motivated, what a pharmacist is going to focus on is numbers and logic. They're going to focus on, all right, here's money, here's hours, here's how you're helping the pharmacy in terms of our number of prescriptions we're doing a day, or the flu shot metrics that are set by corporate. Not that anybody's ever dealt with those. They're so reachable. Anyway, but that same study found that if a pharmacist was to believe that a tech was more intrinsically driven, everything would be a little more inspirational. It wouldn't be driven by those like logic and the numbers. It's going to draw on your emotions. It's going to draw on the, you're helping me and you're helping your clientele. You're helping your patients if you do this extra task. And so it reads very differently in how you would communicate with one pharmacy technician versus the other. So what we did is, among those 20 surveyed pharmacists, we got some messaging. And so the first one here, I would like you to take on the responsibility of supervising other technicians. By taking on this role, you will help increase the number of prescriptions filled per day, demonstrate leadership within the pharmacy, and receive a more stable work schedule. Who do we think that one's going to help? Extrinsic. That's going to help your extrinsic technicians. Meanwhile, for intrinsic, what we received was, I would like for you to take on the responsibility of supervising other technicians. By taking on this role, this is an opportunity for you to invest in other people and have a stronger role of mentorship, make an impact on more of the department, have direct interaction with patients and pharmacists, and ensure our patients' health and well-being. You can see how different messaging is in that case. And so you can see why it's important for your pharmacist to know how you're motivated and how your other technicians are motivated if they want to draw you in on these more advanced opportunities. So, issues of motivation, messaging, and likelihood to take on additional roles. So we've talked about motivation, we've talked about messaging, but we wanted to also look at how likely technicians were to take on additional roles based on those messages. While tailored messaging can be successful, studies have seen that it is the importance between intrinsic and extrinsic values, among pharmacy technicians is far less than perceived by pharmacists. So those same questions that I asked to 20 pharmacists, we asked to 538 technicians. And if you remember among the pharmacists, the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic average was 0.8 of a point on a 5-point scale. There were 500 technicians, the difference was 0.1 of a point. So we're seeing that technicians aren't this monolith. Technicians don't have the singular belief. And it may not even that they are singularly motivated. Maybe they're motivated both ways. Some people here in the classroom have said that themselves. And so that's why it's important. So there's been mixed results on the relationship between messaging style and motivation on how likely role expansion is to be successful. But in that same study, we showed those technicians one of those two messages. And technicians who were high on both were more likely to take on additional roles than technicians who were high or one on the other and didn't see the one that they were. So if we showed our intrinsic message right here, if we showed this message to a more extrinsically motivated, substantially more extrinsically motivated technician, they weren't as likely to take on that additional role. So it's interesting in that case. So as I mentioned, studied pharmacists generally agreed that it's important to tailor task expansion messaging to specific technicians. Now, as the role of technicians continues to expand, it's important that pharmacists and technicians communicate to understand each other's motivations. So, if you are in this room or you're on Zoom, wherever you may be, just consider the importance of talking to your pharmacist, making sure they understand what's important to you. In the previous one, it was mentioned, maybe the hours of the job are more important to you. Maybe that's something that drives you. Maybe it is helping your community. You've been in that community and you're involved and you want to really step up and help in some capacity. Make sure your pharmacist knows that. Because that's also going to help them to say, this person wants to do this. This person wants this additional responsibility. This person wants to help me, help the pharmacy, help the community, help the profession. So once again, communication is vital for the success of role expansion for pharmacy technicians. You have to communicate. The biggest factor that affects pharmacists' comfort levels with pharmacy technicians taking on these additional roles are pharmacists' beliefs about technicians' ability and interest. So if a new role opportunity becomes available and you want to take that on, get the training, and let your pharmacist know that you want to do it. That's going to be more likely for them to let that happen than anything else that's out there. That you can do it and you want to do it. Not your willingness, your want to. If role expansion comes, pharmacists are going to tailor their messaging. If you don't go to them, they may come to you. And the tailoring of messaging to what motivates you is going to increase the likelihood of the technician taking on that role. But most of all, to have the most efficient pharmacy possible, pharmacists and technicians must communicate and communicate well. Okay? Now, I'm Southern and I talk fast and I'm apparently sped through that. So, do you have any questions about anything we talked about today? Yes?
Did you see, similar to hers, that the younger generation, and because there are more roles for us, that the younger pharmacists are more apt to let us expand and grow?
I believe that pharmacists who have a PharmD, it's twofold. I think they are being trained to delegate better than they potentially have in the past. Personally, the class I teach is pharmacy management. That's one of the main things I want to teach them. How to delegate, how to be responsible. Because, no matter what role they go into in my class, I'm like, you're going to be over technicians. You're going to be supervising technicians. And so you need to know how to make that work. But secondly, when you have a pharmacist who has a PharmD versus a bachelor's, that PharmD has so much more clinical knowledge they can apply. They've learned so many additional things beyond counting by fives, what these drugs do, and being able to take it. And and I'm not throwing anything at any bachelor's of pharmacists that I know, because to be honest, they have people skills far beyond most PharmDs I've ever met. But so many PharmDs are coming out now of, I can do point of care testing. I can do diabetes education. I can do MTM. I can do all of these additional things. I need somebody to fill in what I can't cover anymore. And so I think it's that twofold response. Yes?
Comment.
Yes.
When you teach your pharmacy management class and you teach the pharmacy students to delegate, teach them to also add pay.
Trust me.
Because whether a technician is extrinsic or intrinsic thinking, they need to put food on the table.
Yeah, no, that's my next research project, hopefully. Is saying, is there a point where pay goes beyond what motivation? So that hopefully is my next study I'm wanting to look at. But, I get business plans as part of my pharmacy management curriculum that I teach. And I get these salaries they put, and I go, are you sure about that? Are you sure people can live on that? You may want to raise that by about $10,000. You're going to have people, you won't turn over as much. But I tell them in hiring too, I'm like, it costs a lot less to keep somebody than hire somebody new.
That's true.
So,
Just one more comment too. From
Yes.
the web, saying that delegation without micromanagement. Delegation without micromanagement is a factor as well.
yes, avoiding micromanagement, that is super, super important. And so, I know nobody enjoys that in here.